As I was just mentioning before I unmuted you, we have the mayor joining us online, and we also have Councillor Kane joining us online. The mayor is en route back to Burlington, and so she asked if I would lead the meeting, and she will chime in as necessary. So I am calling the Board of Finance to order at 5:35. And the first item on the agenda is the agenda. Is there a motion?
I would move the agenda.
Second.
Thank you. Any comments? All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? And the motion carries unanimously. And the next item is public forum, and is our practice. We will first look to see if there is anyone in the room who wants to speak. And not seeing anyone, we will go online, and I have enabled your microphone, Sharon.
Thank you so much. I'm at the hospital at another meeting, and so I'm in a corridor. Can you hear me all right?
We sure can.
Okay, great. All right. So I'm speaking tonight about the livable wage ordinance that's on your agenda. And as you have moved to bring in-house the compliance monitoring, I've had some concerns, and one of them has already been addressed, which was what you used as a reference point to set the livable wage. And you have amended that to include the joint fiscal office. And that I appreciate, so thank you very much. But there still are two things that I feel need further clarity. The first is the Davis-Bacon wages for contractors. Although that has always been in place, that contractors are paid a decent wage, we never use that as a point to compensate. Now, I understand from the memo that you've included that the current Davis-Bacon wages are pretty comparable to what a livable wage is. So I feel like for today that may be okay, but what isn't addressed is that if indeed there is a deviation, and I'm not sure what deviation would trigger this. What if the Davis-Bacon wages were far less than the livable wage? I don't feel that it would be okay to then accept that wage as a livable wage for those people contracting with us. And so I feel that needs further attention, and or at least further clarity for those of us who really feel that this ordinance is very significant and something that really we don't want to erode the intent of the ordinance because of a real issue, which I admit is the bringing the monitoring in-house and what that means and what needs to be done to make that possible. The second thing, which I know less about, but still have some concerns, is the tool used to determine the cost of healthcare as it's applied to the livable wage if the employer doesn't offer that as a benefit. Are the reference points that are stated here the acceptable ones, or should there be others? I did try in advance of this meeting to get the questions to this, to the answers to these questions before I spoke, but I don't have those answers. And so I'm bringing them forward for the administration and the Board of Finance to consider, if possible, while you discuss this item on your agenda. I won't be able to stay to hear that discussion because I'm now going back to a meeting that is equally important. So to me, so thank you so much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Sharon. Appreciate you making time for both meetings, and Eric will speak to that during that section of the meeting. You can always come back and find us later. Is there anyone else wanting to speak at public forum? Not seeing anyone, we will go ahead and close public forum and move on to the consent agenda. Is there a motion on the consent agenda?
So moved.
Councilor Carpenter, is there a second? Thanks to both of you. We'll go with Councilor Barlow. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And that passes unanimously. And that brings us to our first deliberative item this morning. Nope, it's the evening. It's just dark like the morning, so I don't know what time it is. And that is the BCA reorganization, and it looks like we have Director Kraft and Assistant Director Katz here to talk to us about that. Why don't you give us a brief overview of this item?
Alrighty, would you like me to start or with our mayor, like
Roberta Keel or Roberta,
Why don't you start, as the
Okay.
mayor is having a few connectivity issues, but hopefully she will be able to jump in as needed.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. So first of all, I want to thank everybody who devoted a lot of time and very thoughtful time from HR, from our BCA team, from your office to you, to the mayor, to think through this mini reorg. We call it a mini reorg because it actually is literally that. It is looking at, know that even before the efficiency study and the fee study, that it was a time to begin to look at our organization in all of its departments and the way that we work with many departments and integrate our work through different teams for events and other programs throughout the city. But this is a start, and it is only a first step. It's not a response, as I said, to the efficiency study. I think that's really important contextually because this started 8 months ago in this iteration. And we know that it is important to deepen our bench for fundraising as we go forward, meeting some of the extraordinarily difficult challenges that Burlington will face. There will be budget gaps this year and years to come, and also an appreciation for the changing dynamics of our city. So we want to be part of the solution. This is the beginning. Start from there. What does this mean? It means that we are eliminating a position, the administrative assistant position, and we are reclassifying with those savings, we are reclassifying 8 positions within our organization. And believe it or not, at the end of that, there are still savings that we will appreciate this year and also in the years to come. That's very significant as I said, we deepen our bench in fundraising. That is the most important as we look at what the challenges are that we face both within BCA and within the city. And we look for greater efficiencies and be able to pay for some of those changes. We also had an opportunity here to upgrade our job descriptions. As you remember, the change to becoming a union shop happened for us in a very short period of time without an opportunity to do that review. So now I think we've had some time and those updates have been achieved. We've been able to distribute these new tasks because responsibilities, when you lose a position, obviously you're still doing that work. So we're redistributing those responsibilities across many of our employees and absorbing them within this budget. Most importantly, we're building this organizational capacity that I referred to. It's been a very difficult time for our organization, our department in the city, as we've come out of COVID, as we've had to adjust to the inflation of cost, as we've become more and more integrated into economic recovery for the city, and also taking care of our employees, letting our employees know who worked extra, not just during COVID, but in so many ways, jobs expanded during that time. It takes more time to do things well. It's a more difficult, more competitive environment. And I think we are rewarding just really good employees and saying thank you for the work you do for the city, and if we are going to pay a fair wage for that job. Yeah, those are sort of an overview. Sarah, would you like to add anything to that?
I would just add, just emphasizing that a major motivator here is the strengthening of our development / fundraising efforts, making sure that we can add more capacity to that through the distribution of duties and responsibilities. Is going to be really important for our ability to meet our future revenue challenges, current and future.
All right, we could open it up to questions. Mayor, is there anything you would like to add before we do so?
Yes, briefly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay, trains. Okay. Thank you for your flexibility tonight, everyone. I appreciate it. Hopefully I don't cut out. I just wanted, first of all, I really want to thank Director Kraft and Sarah for being there and going over the details of what the origin of this proposal is. And I really want to acknowledge that this started before we had the operational efficiency study. And I do really appreciate both the work and the spirit for which this comes forward, where we are trying to look at these in every department, and BCA is sort of out front now with bringing this this package. I wanted to I don't think you said this, Doreen, so I just want to make sure people know that you have been working with the union, and the union has affirmed this proposal, and I appreciate that, because I think you said that, as you noted, the BCA positions are fairly new members of the bargaining unit, and so that is an important piece of making sure that the union was consulted, and that we were really looking at this in a way of compensating people fairly based on their work and the additional work they'll take on with the elimination of that administrative position. So I just wanted to round that out a little bit, and again, appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Questions from the board? Comments? Sarah, Councilor Carpenter.
I appreciate the work you've done, and I'll certainly support this, but I'm just wondering and I hear you started this before the efficiency study, but we have the efficiency study and we have something akin to at least a $6 million hole, probably bigger than that. So I'm just sort of wondering, since you're in the middle of doing this work, you don't need to say this at this minute, but if you have a plan B, because I don't think personally we're talking about enough about what happens if we can't make up that gap. And we're gonna have a lot of solutions, but we're almost halfway through the year, but a third of the way through the year. And if we can't find $6 or $7 million, talking about cuts. So I'm just hoping in your work that you have a second layer of thought on this, because it's gonna come up. And I don't want to opine about how this relates to whatever you might do in the next quarter, other than to say, I just think it would be very important to understand that.
We definitely are in the throes of planning, for sure, and very aware that, and I think when Doreen first started speaking, she said this is just our first step, and that we recognize that there's going to be a lot of hard work ahead.
Yeah, I think we all knew that there was going to be a tremendous reorg of sorts for the entire city with the loss of one-time money and all the additional challenges that Mayor has described and everyone recognizes that we're facing. I think I wouldn't say we have a rock with 6 million under it, nor would I say that we have an absolute plan B. What we have is a process of review and analysis that is ongoing and looking both for cuts and for additional revenue generation. And side by side, what does that mean? And then studying the impact that will have on our services within the city. Because for us, a cut doesn't always mean that that's an absolute savings because it's got corresponding revenue. So there's a lot of analysis that will take place. And I also want to say that we're doing this in partnership with other departments, looking at our whole event division or not existing division, but event work within the city and how we can do this more collaboratively, look for efficiencies and perhaps, then find a couple rocks that provide some of the savings. But I really just want to say that, we want to be part of the solution and we're all in this together. Thank you.
Excellent. Other questions?
Yes.
Councilor Barlow, and then, yes, Mayor, would you like to respond?
Yes, just really briefly. Thank you, Councilor Barlow. I think you're so tiny in these screens. Anyway, thank you for pointing my direction. I just wanted to also, because Councilor Carpenter, I think your question is a good one, of course, and broader than BCA. It's a question we're asking all departments as we need to, as we shared at the work session a week ago. We are well into big questions for the city coming up. And one of the things that I mentioned briefly, I think I mentioned this briefly in my mayor update, we have started the budgeting exercise for every department already. That's earlier than normal. And in part is because we know the budget gap expected is another significant one. And we needed departments to frankly do this work earlier in the year in order to really know what we're facing accurately. And in those discussions, or the directions, I should say, really in this budgeting exercise, we did ask for some pretty significant reflections on what budget people will be delivering from each department. And Captain can explain some more on the level of details, of course, but we're being very consistent across the board, asking every department, and I do mean every department, to really look at bringing, delivering a budget that is at the cost of last year's budget, because there's no other major way that we're going to be able to start thinking about how to fill this gap without some significant reflections from folks. And the last piece I'll just say is that we all are asking with a lens of equity here to understand the impacts that any changes in services would mean, especially on folks who are most disadvantaged in our community, and really trying to do this with a lens of care and transparency so that we are prioritizing the core city services.
Excellent. Thank you, Mayor. Councilor Barlow.
Sure. So I appreciate the time Director Kraft spent with me this afternoon, going over some of the same concerns that Councilor Carpenter raised. And I'm confident that this is just a first step, and there are other, we'll be exploring further ways to reduce costs and be more effective than us. So I'm fully supportive of this tonight. Bringing it forward, saving us $63,000 in 2025. So, thank you.
Anyone else? Yes.
I just have some questions around the development director position. So I think obviously depending on the direction we head in, if you're asked to meet the metrics that at least the modern development proposal are asking that you meet, you're going to need a development director. And so first of all, I see in here that after taking these steps with CAO's permission, you would proceed to repost the development director position. I guess maybe it's a question for you, CAO Shad, whether or not the intention is to provide that permission for the development director position to go ahead here. I think I heard that, but I just want to confirm that that we will be reposting that position.
Yes.
Okay, great. My follow-up question to that is, in the 6 months that you've struggled to find someone for that role, have you found that the pay for the position is a hurdle to finding someone for that. And did you consider reclassification of that role as well in this process? And I do see a number of these positions report up to the development director, and so one of the concerns I have is it's potentially going to exacerbate your being able to find someone for that role, given some of the compression that may occur even between other folks in the org chart and classification that we have right now for the development director. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that and just say that given some of the savings here that are realized, I personally would not be opposed to, if you continue to struggle to hire for that role, you're coming back as well for reclassification of the development director position, if that's what you think is recommended here and would help you all, because I think that is a position that, if doing it right, should pay for itself and more, and is vital to your ongoing operations. So those are my thoughts there.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for those thoughts and for the opportunity to come back, but we are hoping we do not have to come back. This position was reclassified a few years ago, and we did it with a market rate analysis that was done by HR, and I think we've gotten it up to a place where it's competitive within the nonprofit world. It's not competitive if you go into education. The last development director had a choice between accepting a job here and at the University of Vermont in their development department, and there was a $38,000 difference for essentially the same job. I mean, a little bit different. I think there's some incredible benefits to working for the city of Burlington. We're a wonderful employer. We take really good care of our employees. There's an environment of where you can be very passionate and specific about creating programs for the community that makes you go home every day and feel good. A little different perhaps than some of the other development jobs that are there, but I realize the pressures often on a family having to accept the higher paid job is there. But I think it is market driven, and I think the market has and is changing. And so waiting for the 6 months that we did, and now exploring with our consultant who works with us on the capital campaign, I may produce some different results. We've also had some time to think a little bit more about how it shaped the whole development department and where those responsibilities are.
That added 20 hours is going to create a little bit more room for this position to be successful in specific lanes of fundraising, as opposed to having to be responsible for everything. It's a very big job of work.
Great. Well, please do keep us updated as to your hiring efforts. Good luck. And yes, I agree.
And send them our way.
Yes.
So if you hear of anybody looking for a meaningful job in fundraising.
Right. And I do agree, working for the city, especially for BCA, is a great opportunity in so many ways. You all are the face of the city for many people here, and so I'm looking forward to supporting this motion in your ongoing efforts.
Any final questions or comments? You ready for a motion?
I'll say that the proposed motion is very lengthy, so I would suggest that we move to recommend that the city council approve and authorize the elimination of the administrative assistant position and the reclassification and retitling of positions as set forth in the memo posted on Civic Clerk.
I love that. Who would like to second that? Thank you, Councilor Barlow. Any comments? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And the motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that brings us to item 4.2, technical amendments to our livable wage ordinance. And for this, I'm going to turn to my left, and Attorney Ramakrishnan will lead us through some exciting changes.
Yes, so thank you. And this was an item that was before you at the last council meeting. It got referred here in lieu of going to ordinance kind of slow the process down and give us a chance to look at it a little bit more closely. And actually that turns out to be fortuitous because I will be proposing one small tweak to the language based on some feedback I've received just before this meeting from the CEDO office. And I'll explain that tweak when I talk about data statement. But I'll give you a quick overview of the ordinance and then including mentioning the tweak in language and then answering any questions that you have. The goal of this ordinance is to streamline our administration of the livable wage ordinance because we did in the middle of this year lose our compliance officers and have not had an easy time. We've not been able to replace them. They did on their way out the door give us suggestions for modifying our ordinance, which is largely where this proposal comes from. That would make it easier to administer and also make it possible for us to do a better job at administering it, quite frankly, which is the goal of this. So that's sort of the why of what we're trying to do. I do want to also speak to, I'll start with the healthcare comment, the comments we heard from former Councillor Busher. One of the things that the ordinance does, just kind of going through point by point from the memo, in addition to the streamlining aspects that I'll talk about, there's a provision in the ordinance as is right now that says that there's a wage you have to pay if you provide your employers with healthcare coverage that's paid for in part by the employer, and if you don't provide that benefit, you have to pay a little bit higher wage. And the differential and the amount that the employer has to contribute when the ordinance was written over a decade ago was $1.20 an hour toward healthcare. The ordinance said that that was supposed to be inflated every 2 years. It didn't say by what measure of inflation. And quite frankly, in the whole history of this ordinance in over a decade, it hasn't happened. So one of the things this ordinance does while we're cleaning it up is it inflates that forward based on CPIU, but going forward, it proposes a measure of inflation that's specific to healthcare. There isn't one CPI. The Department of Labor publishes multiple CPIs, and one of the CPIs that they publish is a CPI specific to healthcare services, which, as you can imagine, is a higher rate of inflation than general inflation. Given the growth in healthcare costs, we just felt like it makes sense to use an inflation factor specific to healthcare. And so now we're fixing a problem with the ordinance. The ordinance doesn't tell us how to inflate. Now it tells us how to inflate, and it tells us how to inflate using a measure specific to healthcare. In terms.
Me neither, Siri.
In terms of whether that's the best possible measure of inflation, I'm not an economist, but I just sort of am trusting the US Department of Labor that their measure is a good measure of healthcare inflation. Moving along, since we are updating the ordinance, it's also appropriate to, the current ordinance identifies what the livable wage was when it was adopted and then tells you how to inflate it forward. Since we're updating it, we need to update it to the current livable wage as the base and then talk about how to move forward. One of the modifications, and I think maybe a modification that's been slightly controversial, as was alluded to in the public comment, was the way that the livable wage is inflated per the ordinance is complicated and in some ways, quite frankly, has caused problems in the past. There's a report from the Joint Fiscal Office of the General Assembly that's published every 2 years. That it's a very good report that relies on very good data that tells us sort of what you need to survive in Vermont depending upon whether you live in a city or not and what the size of your household is. And that report is used for the basis of our livable wage. But our ordinance says that we have to adjust our livable wage every year based on that report, which comes out every other year. And then our ordinance asks us to adjust our methodology from what's in that report. So we actually used to hire a contractor to calculate that for us every single year to the tune of $6,000 a year because of the complexity of it. We no longer do that. But the way it's written has posed some problems. So while we're updating the ordinance and trying to streamline it, what is proposed at this point, and this has changed from an earlier draft of this ordinance. The joint fiscal office methodology is changing this year because problems were identified with it in its most recent version, published in 2023 based on 22 numbers. It actually showed a decline in housing costs, which I think all of us know just is impossible from what we've seen. And that was identified by the legislature as being a problem, and so they've decided to change their methodology for calculating housing costs for the future, which will now be in line with our ordinance, so there will no longer be a discrepancy. We won't have to adjust their numbers to come up with our livable wages. Given that they're coming into alignment and given that it hasn't always proven a perfect methodology, and to streamline things and avoid the problems we've had in the past, given all the complexities, is the current language says that we'll look to the joint fiscal office number, what it recommends as being a livable wage, and every year we'll set our livable wage at the higher of whatever the most recent JFO report suggests, or whatever it was last year plus CPIU. The idea being that we actually generally expect the joint fiscal office number to be a little bit higher than what CPI might provide, but if there are sort of glitches in the future, like happened most recently, our workers will never get paid less than they were getting paid before. And it will make it a lot easier for the CT's office to calculate it. There will be no talk at $6,000 consultants. That's that, and I'm happy to answer questions if there's still confusion about that part of the proposal. Another aspect of this is we did receive some kind of criticisms from our outgoing monitors about the notification requirements in the ordinance. It just basically has to be posted at City Hall. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the crux of it. And they said, you know, you should be doing more to publicize the new rate every year, and that will go a long way in enforcement if people just know what the rate is. So the new ordinance calls for multiple methods of publicizing. One of the two big pieces, and we heard public comment about this, in terms of streamlining, is to align the ordinance to Davis-Bacon, and I want to talk about that in a little more detail. Davis-Bacon is a federal prevailing wage law that applies to construction contracts that have any kind of federal support for them. And generally speaking, it requires workers to be paid more than our livable wage does in most cases that are pertinent to city contracts. The advice that we received is that we actually spend a lot of time and resources monitoring Davis-Bacon contracts because there's so many layers of subcontractors and it gets a little bit complicated. And yet the vast majority of those workers are already required to get paid more than under a livable wage ordinance. So in terms of making use of our monitoring resources, that may not be the best use of resources. And so it was suggested, we already have in the ordinance, if you have a labor contract, that's compliance with the contract is compliance with the ordinance. Why not do the same for Davis-Bacon? And that will allow us to be monitoring a lot of other types of contracts more closely. So that's one of the major changes of this to this. I do want to address one comment that we heard and then kind of toss in the tweak that I mentioned earlier. The comment was, what if right now Davis-Bacon is generally higher than what we require? What if that changes in the future? If history is any sort of guide to the future, that of course everything's on the table now, but that seems highly unlikely. And if it does happen, we know how to amend our ordinance. We're proposing to do it now. And I think that the efficiencies that this will offer us outweigh the risk that we might have to amend the ordinance again in the future. Is my strong feeling on that. I do want to insert the tweak that I want to propose to the ordinance now. It would be at line 137 of the ordinance. And I'll explain the reason for the tweak in just a second. Right now it says likewise for employees covered under the Davis-Bacon Act, payment of wages and provisions of benefits is required under the act shall be deemed compliance with this ordinance. I want to change that, recommend to you to change that to likewise for employees working on highway or heavy construction projects covered under the Davis-Bacon Act, etc. Davis-Bacon has the way it works is there are 4 different categories of contracts that the US Department of Labor does surveys for to find out in every region of the country, and it goes down to the county level, kind of what is the prevailing rate that workers in that industry are getting paid. The 4 categories are highways, heavy construction, building, residential. The employees have to get paid the higher of that prevailing wage that USDOL determines based on survey data, minimum wage, or a federal construction minimum wage, which is $17.20 an hour, which is almost what our livable wage is. So the lowest an employee in Vermont could ever get paid is that federal construction minimum wage. The reason I want to limit this to highway and heavy construction, that's the vast majority of contracts that would be covered under the city contracts fit into those. As I said, there's highway, heavy construction, building, residential. The vast majority of city contracts would fit under those 2 categories anyways. And the rates that are required for those categories are actually quite good. They're quite high. We would have very few employees who would be getting that federal construction minimum wage of $17.20. The other 2 categories, the wages are a little bit lower. And then, well, for residential, they're a lot lower. And the reason I kind of want to propose this change is because it came to my attention just before this meeting that some of the projects that the housing projects that CEDO funds through grant programs are rehabilitation projects and would actually fall under that residential category. And that sort of wasn't what we were targeting with this proposal. So I think we should just rule that, and also while we're at it, the building category, which is a little bit lower too. So we would only be aligning Davis-Bacon contracts that fit into the highway or heavy construction category, and the other categories, they would still have to meet the requirements. If that makes sense. Yes.
So you're telling me that the construction and residential are lower than our livable wage?
The residential, so again, under the Davis-Bacon Act, the employer has to pay the higher of the federal construction minimum wage of $17.20, which is almost as high as your livable wage. Or the local minimum wage, whatever that is, or whatever the survey data is. And for that category of residential construction, which wasn't what I had in mind at all when we were putting this together, those rates are based on the survey data is are quite low actually. And
What survey data?
so the US Department of Labor, to figure out what the
Yeah.
prevailing wage should be, they survey employers
Yep.
to find out what they're paying employees in different categories. And they come up with a prevailing wage based on that survey data. And then the employers have to pay the employee the higher of federal construction minimum wage, the local minimum wage, or the prevailing wage. And just for that one category, what the prevailing wage would be is actually quite low. So all of those workers would be making the federal construction minimum wage if we aligned.
And that's true in Chittenden County?
That's true in Chittenden County, yeah, just for that one category. So that's why I'm proposing that we tweak this so it only applies to employees working on highway or heavy construction projects. The prevailing wages for those categories are quite.
Yes, I'm just, what's the third category? Is residential and
There's residential, heavy construction, okay, heavy construction, highway we're keeping, or I'm proposing that we keep. There's residential and there's building. In the building category, you have a couple of categories that would be making that federal minimum wage. The wages aren't as good, but they're much higher than. That makes sense, or am I still?
I haven't worked on this for many years, so I'm a little fuzzy on it.
Yeah.
I do know from the employer's side that keeping track of Davis Bacon is very difficult because it's just a pain. And my experience, and maybe it's all in the heavy construction end, was they were doing always higher than familiar with. So where I was going with this is just making sure, and obviously we want the workers to be paid adequately, but that we're not making employers do kind of two sets of books. They're having to do Davis Bacon anyway,
Right.
because that's a requirement of the federal money. And acknowledging how difficult or picayune that is, I'll say. And then we're gonna make them kind of keep another set of books for us.
Well, we do that right now,
Yes,
and so the proposal would be as written to not do that, but what I'm proposing is maybe we should still be doing that for the building and
well,
residential.
because I was actually, and again, I'm out of the loop, thinking that was a good step forward, because I've
Yeah.
heard a massive complaints about, you're making me keep track of it twice, I got two sets of wage documents, why do I have to keep, if I'm paying them Davis Bacon and Davis Bacon is better, why are you making me keep another set of books for the city?
Right.
So I just wanna be cautious that we don't take too much of a step backwards in what I think is a good step forward, which is just relying on Davis Bacon. And in the 25 years I worked with it, I never saw it go down.
Yeah,
And so if we're narrowing, well, we'll still narrow the number of people that have to keep the two sets of books. But I just wanna make sure we're not, going too far backwards in the sense of if the wages really are pretty equal, I'd still rely on Davis Bacon.
yeah, the again, for the highway and heavy construction, they're not only equal, they're generally much
They're
better.
better, yes.
They're much better. For the building, you're looking at more employees earning that federal minimum wage, and for the residential, federal construction minimum wage, and for the residential, they're all gonna rely on that because the survey rate is, I mean, in some cases, it's lower than the state minimum wage, which I don't understand how that's possible.
That surprises me.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense, it doesn't fit with the concept that they're surveying local employers, but that's the way it works out. That's not the category I had in mind when we were looking at doing this, so.
Do we have any sense of the volume of contracts that follow that?
The residential is small, it's people who are qualifying for, so we have some home and
Approval.
improvement programs,
Yeah.
and that's all that it would apply to. That set of contracts.
Okay.
Other questions on that, or?
Well, just in that vein, there's small number of contracts, and I'm gonna bet there's small numbers of contractors that are involved and probably not very sophisticated. And this is in the vein of publicizing this better. That we need a wage scale in black and white, and cheat sheet, so.
The other modification, just to streamline this, which I think is probably the most important, that would allow us to bring this in-house, is for contracts that aren't covered under Davis Bacon, and that are over 50,000, we would have a sort of small, short, modified certified payroll record, nothing like what Davis Bacon requires, that contractors would have to submit with their invoice, that they'd be certified under penalty of perjury. And then a small, right now, I mean, basically, the way it worked with our compliance monitors is they would sort of go out and randomly ask people to show them pay records, and then they could request backup documentation for a small subset, similar to like an IRS audit. Not everybody gets audited, a few people do. What we would be looking to do is for those contracts require sort of very short form certified payroll records submitted with the invoice, which we would take a look at, make sure people are certifying that they're paying their employees as they should be. And then for a very small subset of those monthly, request backup documentation. It would be similar to how it's been enforced in the past, but with that little bit of extra paperwork, on the part of the people billing the city, we would be able to, in-house handle the monitoring, and we'd be able to monitor a lot more contracts a lot more closely because we'd be getting that information. That was a recommendation from the hourly monitors. And then another change, kind of, I think of it as a minor change. The CAO under the current ordinance has rulemaking authority, but it's never used because in order to exercise that rulemaking authority, she has to come to the council and get the rules approved by council, so that adopting rules is as complicated as changing the ordinance. What's proposed here is that those rules wouldn't require council approval, but council could always sort of exercise the sort of veto authority. It could, require that a rule be changed or rescinded or whatnot. So that you still have control, but sort of be on the back end rather than having to come and ask permission first. There's been a few times when an ambiguity in the ordinance has been identified that could have been dealt with by making a rule, and just hasn't been efficient to do things that way. So those are the changes that are proposed, and then the additional change that I'm recommending tonight. Are there any other questions about that proposal?
Any other comments? Yes, Councillor Travers.
Thanks for all the work on this. My name is on it as the sponsor, but as additional folks have weighed in here, it's given rise to additional questions as it has on your end as well. And just wanted to confirm a couple of things. One is I did have a question around sort of the existing practice behind inflation for health insurance rates. And sorry, just to confirm here, your understanding is that we just have not been inflating that rate?
It's never happened in
Okay.
the whole history of the ordinance.
Okay, so it stayed as a flat number. We've increased the minimum wage or the livable wage and then added on top of that, right, sort of a flat healthcare rate. Okay, all right. Understood. Is there any concern, given that that number has been flat for so long, moving from 120 to 215 will be a pretty significant jump for those employers that do not provide health insurance? Any sense as to, this is the right thing to do, don't get me wrong, but I'm just wondering, do you have any sense as to, is it going to impact any existing contracts that we have?
I don't have an answer to that off the top of my head. I recognize that it goes up by 95 cents. All I can say is two things. One is that it's been over 10 years and healthcare costs have gone up a lot, and that $1.20 has stayed the same. So it really is no longer reflective of healthcare costs, and doesn't provide much incentive to provide healthcare. So I feel it's appropriate to bring that forward, but it's the policymaker's call. The other thing that I'll say is that even though I'm proposing that going forward, we use an inflation factor that's more specific to healthcare, that 215 actually doesn't reflect that higher inflation factor for the past 10 plus years, for the very reason that was just identified, which is that would have been quite a shock people's pocketbooks. And so I felt that CBIU would be a more appropriate inflation factor to make up for that lost time, and then going forward we'll use a better factor. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, it does.
Just a comment, because I've worked on the back, it's truly gonna affect small nonprofits, many of whom don't offer healthcare. And they don't do it now because employees are encouraged to buy into the marketplace and Vermont Health. So a lot has changed in the last 10 years, including inflation of healthcare costs, but the whole way we reimburse people. I'm short thought, I can't sort of ferret that out. But that's the group it's going to affect a lot. And so we're going to hear from the small not-for-profits. You know, in some businesses, you know, when the whole healthcare marketplace came into being, kind of shifted to, you know, sometimes more reimbursement for wages, but not always. And so I just want us to be cautious and understand who it's going to affect. And I don't know how many of those we've got under contract, but that's what's going to affect.
Mayor.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. Eric, can you remind us what the contract threshold number is, the ordinance to trigger the livable wage ordinance?
It's 15,000.
15, okay. I think it's helpful for the context of what contracts we're talking about. And as I think we also talk about making sure this ordinance gets updated and there is a strong labor standard for the city. This is just begging a much larger conversation we need to have as a city and a state, frankly, about health insurance and how costly it is, not only for the city of Burlington, but the Councilor Carpenter's point, also small employers. But I do think this is a very important one to update and to make sure that we are accurately reflecting the true cost of health insurance, because that's the spirit of this this piece, that in theory, if a worker is not getting health insurance through their employer, they have to go purchase it on their own, and the employee shouldn't. I just really want to be mindful of the employee. That's the whole purpose of this ordinance.
Okay, other comments or questions from the board?
So I appreciate the notice provisions of this. One of the things that sort of stuck out to me is that we're sending it around to all of our NPA steering committees. Don't know how useful it will be for them. I'm not going to suggest that we remove that, but having served on the NPA steering committee, I suspect that they'll sort of be largely confused about why they're receiving this, because the NPAs don't employ anyone or enter into contracts of this value. So just a word of advice that as we start to get into that practice, it would be worthwhile to send along perhaps some, you know, memorandum or something along those lines explaining why that's the case. But I'm fine with including our NPAs on the list. My next question was around the paid leave provisions. So right now we say that covered employers have to provide 12 compensated days off for a full-time employee, proportionate are for part-time employees. And then we have new language in here that says for a contract with a covered employer with a duration of less than 1 fiscal year, the minimum number of compensated days off should be prorated according to the length of the contract. And I'm wondering, I guess I just want to confirm that that's not counterintuitive to the goal here. So is this to say that the number of days that you have off during the term of the contract should be prorated to the length of the contract? Or is it to say that if the contract is less than 1 year, that we can lower that number of 12 days even less for a full-time employee, right? So I mean, right now, if you're a contractor that has a full-time employee, you're supposed to show that you're offering them 12 days. But is there some counterintuitive aspect of this that maybe it's saying, well, if your contract with the city is only for 1 month, then we're only going to expect you to provide 1 day off to that employee. That's using an extreme example, but I guess I just want to confirm that we're not sort of lowering the bar by adding this sentence about tying it to the length of the contract.
So an issue that comes up a lot actually is people who are hired to do, you know, maybe they need to fix the pipe on our water system. They're hired for 2 weeks. And it's a small local mom and pop vendor and they don't have a paid employee benefit. And if it's a 2 week contract and the livable wage ordinance says that, you know, for the duration of the contract, for the employees who are working for the city under the contract, you shall do these things. And it makes it so if we were to interpret that as, okay, because you're gonna do a 2 week contract for the city, you have to change all of your employment policies and give all of your, you know, employees 12 days off a year, which you don't currently do. we can't get work done sometimes, and so given the ambiguities in the ordinance and that circumstance that has been construed already, that it's, you know, it's 12 days a year if you were doing a year-long contract, but if it's a shorter contract, it's prorated, and you know, if your employees don't use that time by the end of the contract, make sure you pay them out. That's an interpretation that's been given to it, and without that interpretation, there are certain things we couldn't contract for, it would be impossible. And so this puts that interpretation into the ordinance to avoid that. And I understand the concern, being that, you know, we're not getting the employees the maximum benefit that we're trying to, but we also have to be conscious of the fact that there are these very, very short contracts out there that we just, again, wouldn't be able to enter. Of that.
Okay. You touched on my follow-up question here, which is that, is it our existing practice that employers that contract with the city are required to allow employees the ability to cash out or leave at the end of the contract term?
It's something that I'm told by monitors has come up as a point of confusion for a long time. It's not in the ordinance, and my understanding, and forgive me if I'm wrong, I'm still fairly new to the city, but my understanding from the conversations I've had is that there have been different interpretations of that over the years. But because we do have a lot of these very short construction contracts, the issue does come up. Well, I only have to agree to these things during the term of the contract, and what if my employee doesn't use their paid time off during the term of that contract? What then? And we want to be able to say, well, if they didn't take advantage of that benefit, and you're going to take it away from them as soon as the contract is done, we want them to be able to get the benefit, which means they should have the ability to cash out. So that provision is meant to answer a question that's come up that the current ordinance doesn't really provide a clear answer to.
Okay. I mean, I'm comfortable with it. It is something that goes beyond what's required by Vermont law, and that Vermont, you're not required to cash out when you leave, you know, employer can have a policy. So it's potentially is requiring some Vermont employers that do business with Burlington to do more than, I would say, what actually I think most employers do in Vermont, that they do not cash out. I don't know if the city like cashes out. We do. We have a practice of doing that. Okay, right. All right, I'm comfortable with it. I guess I just wanted to flag for fellow committee members that it is going beyond what's required under Vermont law. The mayor has a point, and I just said I had two other questions, one around Davis-Bacon and then one around rulemaking authority, but I see the mayor raised her hand.
Go ahead, Mayor.
Thank you. I just also want to note to that point, Councillor Travers, that the only contract minimums for state contracts though are for Davis-Bacon related work, and the city for the last 10 years does it for all of its contracts with livable wage standards. So we've already been doing for 10 years a different labor standard, just to round out that thought a little bit. So to me, we have a much wider, higher labor standard for much more diverse work than the state. And I wish the state would actually follow Burlington's lead, because this is a better for workers.
On Davis-Bacon, do you have any sense of the amount of time that is spent on compliance of the Davis-Bacon contracts? I guess as we're making this determination, I want to make sure, is it an extra couple hours that goes into compliance for Davis-Bacon, or is it an extra sort of 60 hours that goes into compliance with these Davis-Bacon contracts?
Davis-Bacon is subject to its own compliance requirements, and quite frankly, it gets monitored more closely than we have the resources to monitor this. And so any contracts that the city, especially highway contracts, where we're getting federal money through the state, then on to us, the state is actually doing quite a bit of monitoring, there's my understanding. From my understanding of how we've monitored in the past, we've also in turn done most of our livable wage monitoring around those things that are already covered under Davis-Bacon. So the majority of our monitoring is gone into those contracts. Because of the complexity of multiple layers of subcontractors, and because they have the certified payable records for inspection. For the reasons that Councilor Carpenter noted, that seems duplicative and not a good use of our time, so if we could sort of move those contracts aside as something we spend a lot less time focusing on, we could spend our time focusing on other contracts that aren't getting a lot of attention at all. That aren't subject to their own rental regime.
It was a lot when I remember.
Well, so I mean, here's my concern around it, right? The only reason that $17.20 is $17.20 right now is because an executive order that President Biden entered to set that at $15, and then it's moved up since then. That could go away tomorrow, basically, right, depending on the results of the election. And as I look at, I agree with you that even sort of the heavy and highway wage determinations are even higher than the 1720 and shouldn't be impacted. But some of the roles that you see a lot in Burlington construction projects, like you know, a flagger, for example, in traffic control, even under the highway construction program, that's set at $12.66. So you know, I do have some concern, even for sort of the highway and heavy projects, that there may be some individuals who are falling through the cracks here, so to speak, as compared to a number of the other folks on contracts. So I don't know, I guess I just wanted to put it out there. I that's the reason why I asked sort of how many hours are we talking about here, because I think it's a balance between, are we willing to risk some folks potentially, depending on the results of tomorrow's election in large part, sort of falling through the cracks, for lack of a better term, because of the amount of time that goes into monitoring these contracts, the vast majority of which don't present an issue, or should we maintain status quo, which is that we're looking at everything here. I could see the argument both ways, but I guess just wanted to raise the point. I'm at the very least supportive of the amendment that you proposed here, which is that we would leave out of the consideration heavy and highway wage determinations. I don't think we should keep it the way it is right now. I guess the question I have is whether or not we go even further, which is to maintain the current practice of just reviewing all contracts.
I mean, I would, relative to whatever happens tomorrow, I mean, as Eric pointed out, we can revisit the ordinance, so I think today, you know, I think that's a good guidestone for the make, and I think every year, but we should just look at that and see, you know, if we perceive, or not even perceive, know that that's changing, then I think we will revisit it. I just, my recollection again is stated, you know, as I said, sort of keeping the two sets of books is a significant problem. Now, it's not for certain employers, but and you know, some of the heavy, you know, heavy construction, highway people actually are fairly sophisticated, so I don't have this sort of as much sympathy for them, but some of the smaller contractors that follow that same definition, it can be very labor intensive.
Yeah. My concern is with us having the resources to monitoring more than just construction projects, because that's where most of our monitoring has been going, even though we have a lot more covered employees. And if the law does change, if the new executive order is issued that lowers that rate, then I think we can easily come back and revisit that. You know, I don't have a crystal ball. I think the odds of that happening are relatively low. And assuming that the law stays the same, this would enable us to do a lot more for a lot more workers.
Well, I think that's a good capacity to have, you know, there's no, if we're being redundant over here and then we're missing people over there, maybe we're better getting the missing people over there and not as focused on where there could be redundancy.
That's Yes, and I hear, and it's, you know, you're all the policymakers, not me. But that's sort of the calculus that went into this. Assuming that rate stays where it is.
Okay. Mark, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, you covered some of my questions and.
Okay, so to confirm, Eric, your proposal is that basically on line 93, that it would be $50,000 or more per fiscal year, not otherwise covered under the highway or heavy wage determinations under the Davis-Bacon Act.
It would be at 137. Well, yeah, I need to write it, there needs to be, let me take a look at where you're at. So, we can have both places, thank you.
Okay, so on line 93 and line 137, we would confirm that it's just the heavy and highway wage determinations.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
I have one last point. I'm curious in terms of any other areas that have rulemaking authority, particularly in your office, Catherine. Is there any other practices where rulemaking authority is done by your office without council approval? Or would this be sort of a new standard?
I don't know the answer to that, Eric.
We don't have much of a practice. For the other jurisdictions I've worked for to that liberty. It's not a common practice here, but it strikes me that if we are going to give someone rulemaking authority, if the point of it is to allow them to implement rules that we need to, not a lot of red tape, they should have that authority and the council should have sort of back and veto rather than, because if we have to go to council to implement the rulemaking authority, we might as well, rather than just change the ordinance into the situation that comes up. There's no efficiency realized in having to go to council.
Okay. Given the newness around some of the direction that we're heading into, I'm thinking about this more. I have some discomfort with removing the council prior to promulgating other rules. I think as we move forward here, we'll see what rules come forward, and we find that it's an added level of sort of red tape that's unnecessary, then like we've been saying, we can go back and change the ordinance, but I would be curious to hear others' thoughts on whether or not the council should retain its existing authority, which is to see any new rules prior to them going into effect, or do you prefer the standard that's been proposed, which is make a rule and then give us?
And this is just about the livable wage ordinance.
Right, yeah, right.
I mean, personally, I'm fine with having come to us, I mean. Unless everything goes awry, and this would be with permission from the mayor, assuming, it's not a deep, broad authority that's given the CAO. You know, it's the tweak stuff.
Right.
And I suppose if we had a renegade CEO, a CAO, we would be worried, but we don't know that until the things reported to us. And I do worry, just generally speaking, bigger picture, we can spend a lot of time on little things. And so when no history either way in this, I'm willing to trust that proper due diligence would be done by the CAO and that they would not be promulgating all kind of new rules that would screw up the program, and I'm also presuming that that would get some approval from the mayor, as CEO, so that's, I don't worry about it. I think there are other, what do I say, like, authorities within departments, like speed limits for one, that, voters might much prefer come to the council, and this just seems, could be time consuming, but that's just me.
I can see it both ways,
Yeah.
I guess, and I tend to be an incrementalist on these things, so I would say, and this, I would say maybe we go more slowly on this one provision, bring it to the council, so it's not too much to. But I'd be persuaded. I don't know if Joe has thoughts on it.
Two examples off the top of my head, and please forgive me if I'm misstating things, but the section 8A of the charter, the non-solicited voter provision has making the burning title. It requires going to the council, and similarly under the gross receipts, I don't think that requires going to the council.
I think you're right. Well, maybe what we could do here is, because the council's not gonna become aware of it just from it being posted on the city's website, so maybe if we could add some additional language in here that says that, upon the new rules being promulgated, that, that they must be sent immediately or promptly to the city council, so something along those lines, right? Not just posted on the city's website, but sort of proactively sent to the city council.
I mean,
It's a communication.
Yes, right, so line 141. We need a B in here, shall be posted on the city's website and, and promptly communicated to the city council.
would it help to have them reviewed by the Board of Finance? Not necessarily approved, but just reviewed. So they'd be on our agenda. They'd be public. But it just might make it more transparent as opposed to posting. And at least, four of us could object if we want.
So we would be deleting, well, I guess we could leave post on the city's website.
Yeah, you can leave that.
We
Yeah,
could
you
say
post on the city website.
become effective upon approval by the Board of Finance and posting.
I'm just tossing that out as a, rather than just go to the whole council.
I mean, that's fine. Right. Shall we post on the city's website and promptly communicate it to the Board of Finance?
It was on our consent agenda.
Right. Okay, I don't think we need to say approved by, but if we could just put in there that some obligation to, we're sending the livable wage to the NPAs, but it's sending the rules to the Board of Finance.
Which shall be promptly communicated to the Board of Finance and posted on the city's website.
Okay, that's fine by me. Those are all my points and questions.
Great, are we done? Do we need a motion? We have an action here that says review and report back to the city council. I believe we have reviewed.
Yes, I'm gonna propose a motion, and if somebody wants to move it, they can just say so moved. I'm gonna propose that the motion be that you recommend that the city council approve the proposed ordinance making technical amendments to the city's livable wage ordinance, subject to amendments at line 93 and 137, limiting coverage under the Davis-Bacon to highway and heavy construction contracts, and subject to amendments to lines 141 and 142, requiring prompt communication of administrative rules to the Board of Finance.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And the motion carries unanimously, and that brings us to adjournment, and without objection, we will adjourn at 6:49 p.m. Thank you very much.